Good evening. How are you all doing? Welcome to everybody here and at home today on the 175th anniversary of Poe's death here in Baltimore. We have a great speaker for you today. David Gaylin, the author of The Final Days of Edgar Allan Poe, Nevermore in Baltimore, is here with us.
Some say the author, some say the perpetrator.
David, let me introduce you real quickly, David. David is a retired business owner from right here in Baltimore, where the shadow of Poe is ever present. A lifelong student and collector of Poe, his passion for the poet and writer previously produced the book Edgar Allan Poe's Baltimore in 2015, which is on the table in the back. Another great work. When he's not writing books or poetry, David volunteers at the Poe House, where he is a senior docent. He also is a member of the Poe Studies Association and currently serves as the president of the Edgar Allan Poe Society here in Baltimore. If you're interested in Poe and you spent much time in Baltimore, I'm sure you've crossed paths with David. I first met him several years ago when I was doing a program. I should introduce myself. My name's Evan Dennis. I'm the Special Collections Librarian here at Enoch Pratt Free Library, where we have manuscript collections, photograph collections, primary sources. Notably, we have the Edgar Allan Poe collection, and that's how I first encountered David when I started this position. I was giving a program at Baltimore County, I think, the first time I met you, and you politely afterwards introduced yourself and corrected me. I was butchering a couple pronunciations, and he very quietly and graciously corrected my pronunciations,
I
which
met
I
you.
appreciate.
I met you before that. When you were at Maryland Historical Society.
I met David when I was at the Maryland Historical Society.
And you helped me with the first book.
Oh, well, I'm glad we're having this conversation. I get to learn a thing or two.
Very helpful with the first book.
I appreciate that. And I realized how gracious David was as I read his newest book. And I saw how many facts about Poe I had been embellishing and making up, and we'll talk about that a little bit tonight. I want to ask you how you got interested in Poe, but before that, do you have a reading you can share with us from the book before we get started?
Yeah, I can read from the book, sure.
Cool, thanks, David.
I'm just going to read an excerpt from the introduction, just a short passage. Anyone attempting to offer a solution to the riddle of Edgar Allan Poe's death must recognize it as two separate and distinct mysteries. How did he come to be discovered at a tavern in East Baltimore? And what illness or condition actually brought him down? While a malady such as encephalitis, pneumonia, or delirium tremens may have killed him, these medical conditions lend little insight into what occurred before his discovery. And when some have espoused cooping, the practice of kidnapping and compelled voting, to be the cause of death, it is difficult to see how one can die directly from being forced to participate in the political process. That is, unless assault is involved, which I don't think it is here. Of course, it can be argued which of the two questions is the more important. But a straightforward discussion of the cause has been made difficult and needlessly ambiguous by admirers of Poe who refuse to consider that the genius also had human weaknesses. These devotees, who have been blind to his flaws and failings, have done as much to abuse the truth of his life and death as those in a second group. I have to turn the page. Who would have everyone believe that he was nothing but an unprincipled inebriate. Of these two opposing camps, one of the Poe's contemporaries, Thomas Dunn English, said, quote, "One is made up of those who like to expose the darkest part of personal history to public view. The other of the injudicious admirers of the dead poet who try to prove that he was a saint and think they aid their object by abusing everyone with whom he ever had a quarrel." Close quote. By rejecting his vulnerabilities, these well-meaning supporters have muddied the story of Poe's passing, and in doing so, opened the door to an embarrassment of maladies, afflictions, and preposterous ideas on his cause. It should be stated, at the time of Poe's death, there were no arguments, public or private, as to its cause. At the hospital in which he died, there seems to have been no deliberation among those who had cared for him. This is evident in the letter sent to his aunt, Maria Clem, a little over a month after his passing by the facility's administrator, Dr. John J. Moran, in which he stated, quote, presuming you are already aware of the malady of which Mr. Poe died, close quote, clearly indicating an accepted cause. No mystery. Those who would have raised any questions, especially those who were acquainted with his reputation, were satisfied by the prevalent rumors of a drunken debauch. Indeed, all those who rendered aid to Poe at the tavern and the hospital, all eyewitnesses to his condition, remarked about his apparent intoxication. Even those who had no personal knowledge of the circumstances, such as his mentor and patron, John Kennedy, were convinced at the time that Poe's death resulted from an alcoholic binge. It is true that some would later revise their original statements in an effort to decontaminate the poet's name, while others would exaggerate his condition to promote a personal cause or enmity. But the mystery of Poe's death would not be generated until years after its occurrence, and mostly by those seeking to rescue his reputation. So it would be more accurate to say that Poe's death has become a mystery than to say it has endured as one.
That's a great question. When I was preparing the questions for today, I had a huge list of questions, and I had to whittle it down, and that reading kind of foreshadows most of this. Before we get into those, though, you just mentioned rescuing his reputation. How do you fit into that? And can you tell us a little bit about, before we get into the story, who are you and what drew you to Poe, and what's your background and what made you write this book?
Well, my involvement with Poe and my enthusiasm for Poe is nothing really special. I was raised by my grandmother, who had an appreciation of literature, and poetry especially, and she read to us as children. And Annabel Lee really stuck in my mind, and it became my sister's favorite poem. But beyond that, I was just exposed to Poe, like everyone else in grade school. In 1976, when the Alan Parsons Project was released, that really put a fire under me as far as Poe and my enthusiasm for Poe.
What was the name of the Alan Parsons, the project?
It was called Tales of Mystery and Imagination. And in my mind, it's arguably the best adaptation of Poe's works, a musical adaptation of Poe's works. Even still. But after hearing that and becoming enthused after that, I wanted to know all I could about Poe, about the man, about his life, and about his death. And of course, there was very little about his death. Even in all biographies, there were barely a few pages in all the biographies. As far as protecting Poe's reputation, that was one of the reasons why I got involved with the Poe Society. I saw all these efforts to make Poe into the godfather of goth and all this dark and doom, and that's not what Poe was. That's not who he was, and that's not not really good for his reputation. I mean, we have Raven beer, which is which is not really good for Poe's reputation either.
One of the things I love about the book so much is that whenever we have someone that comes into the library to research Poe, everyone has their own opinion of how he died, and I feel like it says a lot about who they are. And this isn't a gotcha book that you don't come here to find the answer. This is I describe this as this book trying to apply logic and reason to get beyond the sensationalism behind Poe's death. And I think it was a book that was desperately needed. And I guess that leads into my first question. It's, what about the subject of his death is so important? Why can't people stop talking about it? And why are they so passionate about this topic?
Well, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't really know. I mean, there's a lot of, especially in the last 10 years or so, there seems to be a lot of focus on conspiracy theories. But as far as Poe's death in relation to his works and his canon, I don't really think it's that important. I mean, there's been studies done, whether his drinking affected what he wrote and that sort of thing, his creativity. And as far as his reputation goes, I think, or his fame, death certainly plays a role in that. His mysterious death certainly magnified his fame. There's no question about that.
So there are over, this is kind of a fun question. In the book, you said there are 40 potential causes listed. When we were talking the other day, you said that number might have gone up since you published the book that you know of.
I did. I actually found another one. It may warrant including in the revised edition. It's a fungus infection. Someone actually wrote about him succumbing from a fungus infection of the brain.
I like that one. I was going to ask, what's the most ridiculous of the 42? Which one makes you laugh the most?
Well, I can read. I've marked some here. I can probably read some to you. Rabies is the one that the most current one, and it really has no foundation whatsoever. But I'll read the entry in the appendix here. Rabies is a deadly encephalitic virus that is usually contracted through the bite or saliva of an infected animal. Symptoms include fever, headache, confusion, hallucination, hydrophobia or fear of water, and hyperactivity. A doctor of cardiology, Michael Benitez, claimed that Poe exhibited symptoms of hydrophobia when in the hospital. However, his study relies on flawed information, some of which was derived from Dr. Moran, who at first indicated that Poe had difficulty swallowing liquids. But then in two separate accounts given later, Moran stated that when administering water and beef tea to Poe, he drank without any trouble. Without the presence of hydrophobia, the probability of encephalitic rabies as a cause is negligible. As far as silly ones go, I would think somebody wrote that he suffered from syphilis and that caused his death. And I'll write here. I'll read here what I wrote. Syphilis is a bacterial infection usually spread by sexual contact, and if left untreated, can spread to the brain and neurosyphilis. Later stage symptoms include paranoia, anxiety, mood swings, and changes in personality, severe headaches, ataxia, which is difficulty in muscle coordination, paralysis, lingual dementia. Dr. Gordon, who proposed the theory, theorized that Poe had been infected with neurosyphilis or general syphilis when he was younger, and that his terminal symptoms were consistent with the disease. I disagree. Syphilis, I'm not a doctor, but syphilis is a chronic thing. The symptoms are progressive, and it wouldn't have caused the acute terminal symptoms that caused it. To me, that's really around the bend.
One of my favorite things about the book is also no matter how ridiculous the theory seems, you're very even in your approach. You're saying what are the sources, what backs this up, what doesn't back this up, and you just lay the case out. In a very fair way. I realized that my favorite theory is the Cooping theory, and it seems I believe that's yours also. And I desperately wanted to believe that theory, maybe not as much after reading your book.
I did too.
Could you talk a little about the Cooping theory for those that aren't familiar?
Cooping,
with that.
If you're not familiar with it, is the practice of kidnapping people before an election and anesthetizing them with alcohol, or getting them sloppy drunk to the point where they can't resist, and usually means repeat voters. It's called cooping because they were held in these cells or coops, basements, backyards, that sort of thing. That's how it got its name. The practice was well established by the time of Poe's death. But in my mind, cooping is a set of circumstances. It's not really a cause of death. Like I mentioned when I opened the introduction, it's hard to understand how somebody can die from being forced to participate in the political process. Again, as long as assault is removed from the equation, which I believe it is. But now cooping could have caused the circumstances that facilitated his death. I mean, the drinking, getting him drunk, and then withdrawing the supply, that could have caused delirium tremens, of course, and that's a different matter altogether.
Cooping would also, in my mind, require some sense of anonymity. And I often wonder about, I've gone back and forth with this, but how well would Poe have been recognized by people in his time?
Poe had the habit of, when drunk, of being effusive and calling attention to his celebrity. I mean, when he got drunk, he pointed out to people how superior he was and who he was, and he would actually recite some of his works, in bar rooms and that sort of thing. So to use him as a repeat voter and trot him around town, he would have probably called attention to himself, and they would have got caught. That's one of the flaws in the theory.
And the theory about getting assaulted, getting mugged, he wasn't wearing the right clothes. He seems to have been robbed. Is there truth to that, or did your research find
Poe was
anything
found in
different?
clothing that seemed to be retrieved from the trash. I mean, the clothing was soiled, it was ripped. These were clothes that people would have thrown out. The boots the heels were worn off the bottom of the boots and that sort of thing. There are other explanations for the clothes besides cooping. What these political partisans would do is they would vote you, they'd bring you back to the coop, they'd change your clothes, and they'd vote you again. And theoretically, the election judge wouldn't recognize you if you were wearing different clothes. But there are other explanations for the clothes that have nothing to do with cooping. They're not very attractive, but they're just as plausible. And if you remove the clothing from the theory, again, it weakens the theory.
It also makes you wonder if the election judge, even if they recognize Poe, if he shows up with some ruffians, if they would challenge it at all, you know.
You have to. There is compelling evidence to support that these election judges were involved as well.
Oh, really? That's very interesting. Moving on a little bit, one of my favorite topics to talk about. And by the way, I'm going to give the audience a chance to ask questions at the end. It's not just going to be me talking and cherry picking my favorite questions. But I would like to know a little bit more. Research interests me. I'd like you to talk about how the collection here at Enoch Pratt aided your research in this book.
It's safe to say that without the letters here and without the collection here, that I could not have told the story that I did. I flagged some examples here that not just about his death, but I mean the letters that he wrote to different people really brought out parts of his life that I needed in the biography. And see if I can find them here real quick.
And while you're looking for those, I'd just like to point out to people hearing at home, our Edgar Allan Poe collection, a significant chunk of it can be seen online if you Google Digital Maryland, Google Enoch Pratt Library and the Edgar Allan Poe collection, and you'll be able to see some of the things that David speaks about tonight. And for those of you that are here, I also have some facsimiles of the manuscripts on the back table afterwards. You can take a look at those.
One of the letters that are here at the Pratt library in the collection was a September 18th, 1849 letter that he wrote to Mariah Clem while he was in Richmond, about 2 or 3 weeks before he died. And it really illustrates his frame of mind and and how he felt at the time, and how depressed he was and how disgusted he was with things. And it's absolutely vital to put his death in context, that letter especially. But not just letters that he wrote. There was a letter written to Sarah Sigourney Rice, who put together a memorial edition for the Poe tomb, for the Poe Memorial. That was in 1875. She wrote to Sarah Rice with information about his viewing, about the funeral that was held at the hospital. And up until I read that, I thought that a viewing and funeral service was held at his uncle's house, at Henry Herring's house on Pratt Street. But after I read that letter, I realized that they actually did have a viewing at the hospital. And then, of course, without question, the single most important letter is the one that Dr. Moran wrote to her 5 weeks after Poe's death. That's probably the single most important document involving Poe's death, and it describes his symptoms in detail. And to my mind, it supports the theory of delirium tremens.
Now, you talk a lot about how Dr. Moran later in his life embellished things quite a bit, and this made him seem unreliable. And that may have made people second guess the primary source so close to Poe's death. Can you talk a little bit about Dr. Moran, who he was, and how his story changed, and his role in how people view Poe's final days?
When Poe was found at a tavern at Gunner's Hall on Lombard Street, he was taken to a public hospital on Broadway. Dr. John J. Moran was the administrator of that hospital, and it was under his care that Poe fell. Moran may have been very close to Poe's care, or he, as an administrator, to my mind, he probably had no involvement whatsoever at all, and just claimed afterwards that he did. But anyway, after Poe died, Moran claimed to have been the primary caregiver for Poe, and he made up all these stories. He made Poe recite these eloquent soliloquies on his deathbed, and of course, none of this is probably true. This really came out when Moran decided to become an expert on Poe and the authority on Poe in 1875. But anyway, Moran made so much stuff up, and he fibbed so much that most scholars and biographers don't believe anything he said. And part of what I did here is I went through and I studied him in depth, and I was able to sort some of the facts from the fibs that he gave, and not everything he said was untrue.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the letter close to Poe's death, he does talk about the last hours and minutes, Poe seeing visions and spirits, if I'm not mistaken.
The phrase was spectral images on the wall, I think.
Spectral images on the wall. It's a lot better than
and
spirits.
That's actually a symptom of delirium tremens, which supports that theory. But Dr. Moran, again, is administrator of a hospital. His letter, when he wrote to Mariah Clem 5 weeks later, he appears to be transcribing from a case record, a hospital case record.
Mm-hmm.
That was he could have prepared, but more likely was prepared by his interns and stewards, and he may not have been with Poe at all during his death.
And who was with Poe during his death? Is that a question that can be answered, or? Well,
with some certainty, after Moran started printing all these newspaper articles about what Poe's ending was like, and reciting all these speeches that he gave, there was an intern, or actually a doctor, that came forward to refute everything that Moran was saying. He came forward to say that Moran wasn't even there, that the doctor's name was William Cullen, and he claimed that he was the one that cared for Poe, and Dr. Moran wasn't around at all. And there is substantial evidence to support his claim.
The utterance of the name Reynolds, do you have any, in your view, is that nonsense? No, I think that's along with the spectral, what was it, spectral?
Talking to spectral images on the wall.
I do not want to get that wrong. Talking to spectral images.
Conversations with spectral
images on the wall.
Henry Reynolds was one of the election judges at the Fourth Ward poll, and his job ultimately, ostensibly, would have been to qualify and disqualify voters. But he also would have been orchestrating, as a Whig partisan himself, he would have been orchestrating the tally of votes for the Whig candidate. So he would have been one of the ones involved in the cooping theory. And he would have been the one to disqualify Poe or discontinue his supply of alcohol, which is, pretty compelling reason why Poe might have been yelling his name in the hospital. Um, there is another story that he was yelling Herring in the hospital, and not Reynolds, but that came from Moran, and that's one of the ones I don't believe.
Besides the Moran letter, I would say when we have people visit the library, that's probably the primary source that people investigating this look at the most. But after that, we also have, and I'll show this to you in a second, but we also have the lock of hair. Can you talk about the lock of Poe's hair? And I get asked, there's a lot of mythology around Poe even here, and I'm told anecdotally that we've had the hair tested before. Can you confirm or deny, well, talk about where we got the hair. Can you confirm or deny that I'm really putting you on the spot here, that this hair has been tested, and even if it has been, could that even tell you anything? I'll pull it out and show everyone that's here while you're talking.
The provenance on the sample is pretty unshakable. I mean, it came from Amelia Poe. Came from Poe's family. While he laid in repose in the hospital, some viewers took samples, and that was the custom back then. You did that. So the chain of custody has been established on the lock of hair, so we know it's the real thing. And about 25 years ago, there was a metals test. They took samples of the hair and did a metals test. The reason they did that was the fellow was trying to establish that Poe was poisoned in some manner. His belief was Poe suffered from carbon monoxide poisoning, and that's why he arranged they used a spectrograph, I think, or spectrogram to test for heavy metals. And they found levels of mercury, arsenic, lead, but none at toxic levels, nothing that would have actually contributed to his death or caused his death.
And mercury, arsenic, toxic metals, these are all different. When you count the 40, these are all different
theories on his death. Mercury poisoning, of course, not lead, but the lead was probably from the water they were drinking back then. They tested, at the same time they tested his hair, they tested a sample of his wife's hair, Virginia, and she had similar levels of metals in her hair. So it was probably the environment, as a result of the environment.
One of the fun things that we get to do, one of the dangerous part of a librarian's job, yes, they're dangerous parts of our job, but books from a certain era also, if they have a royal green hue to them, are often made with arsenic. So if I had a favorite theory that's based on absolutely nothing, it would be that he long-term arsenic exposure due to being a heavy reader.
Not to change the subject, but you see all this treated lumber that decks are made out of. And the reason it's treated with arsenic to kill the bugs and keep the bugs away. And these decks are being put on these portable classrooms around the city with the kids grabbing the hand railings. I don't get it. I don't understand why they're doing that. But there's heavy measures of arsenic in this treated lumber.
Yeah. There are all sorts of little details I picked up from your book, and I wanted to talk about one that might be obvious to some people, but you dispel the myth that Poe was a habitual drunkard until the death of Virginia. And this was news to me. I'm curious how much Griswold had to do with this, and could you talk about Griswold for a second and how much he sullied Poe's reputation, and if he was involved in.
Griswold would fill an evening by himself. I mean, to explain him, Rufus Griswold was involved in the magazine trade initially with Poe in Philadelphia, and that's where they met. And they immediately became rivals, not enemies, just rivals. Both Edgar Allan Poe and Griswold saw themselves as the supreme arbiters of poetry in America, of who was the best poets and who was not. And that's part of the rivalry. But Poe elevated it when he went on the lecture circuit and he slammed these anthologies that Griswold created on poetry. He slammed Griswold, saying that he didn't know what he was doing. He had the wrong people in the books. He didn't include the ones that should have been in there. And this got back to Griswold, and he never forgot it. But he hid his hatred of Poe under a veneer of civility. And Poe probably thought that he didn't piss him off as much, or he had forgiven him. And at the time of his death, apparently he wanted Griswold. He expressed an interest in Griswold to become his literary executor, to edit his collected works after he died. After he died, his aunt contacted Griswold, and Griswold edited his work. He took the appointment and edited his works, and he did a competent job. I mean, the first 2 volumes of Poe's work, Griswold did a really good job. It's really something to have. But in the 3rd volume, Griswold added a biography, and he let loose on Poe. He clobbered him. He painted him as not just a drunk, but as a degenerate. He had an illegal relationship with his aunt. I mean, he forged letters to make Poe look worse than he was. And this biography stood unchallenged for the first 25 years in his existence. In other words, if you went and you wanted a collection of Poe's works, you got the biography. If you wanted a biography of Poe, that's where you went. You bought the collection. And it stood unchallenged for 25 years, and it did the job. It changed everybody's opinion of Poe to the point where even my father in Baltimore, coming up through Baltimore public schools and during the Depression, was taught that Poe was not someone you would read. You know, he's not someone you should be enthused about.
You can't go. It's impossible to know anybody's motivations, right? But from what I got, was there romantic rivalry? There was
actually a romantic rivalry between the two. They were both after the same woman in New York, Frances Osgood, and she took a shine to Poe, but she wanted nothing to do with Griswold, and that didn't help either.
We have a poem from Poe to Frances Osgood. It's an acrostic poem, and that her name, she's a famous American poet, and her name is hidden diagonally throughout the poem. And we have the only thing in Virginia's hand, which is, I don't know if it was a response to that, but it's simpler, and it's an acrostic poem to Edgar Allan Poe down the side. Me promoting our collection a little bit more. But to get back to Griswold, we don't know his motivations. There was possibly that. Do you have an opinion one way or the other, whether it was he just didn't like Poe, or is there a chance that if he was responsible for spreading the work of Poe far and wide, if he had a financial stake in it, people would be more excited to read horror stories by a degenerate rather than like a nuanced guy?
That may be true, but you're right in a sense that what Griswold's effort kind of backfired because it intrigued people about Poe, especially Americans. It intrigued, it piqued people's interest in Poe, and it grew. And Griswold's poisonous biography actually backfired and helped his fame anyway, not his reputation, but his fame.
Moving on from Griswold, I guess we've given him enough time. There is a detail in your book that I wanted to discuss, and this isn't like your thesis or anything. This is a small detail, but the book's full of little anecdotes like this that I found fascinating. But you talk about, at one point, there's a theory that a popular theory about Poe's final days, where he actually got on the train and started going to Philadelphia and then was sent back. And you talk about how you lay out the case for why you don't think this was possible. And the librarian in me, the researcher in me, really would love it if you would get into the details of how you did that research and figured out that the theory of him getting halfway to Philadelphia and being sent back was fictitious.
Three biographers bought into that, and bought into that idea that he actually actually made his train connection on the way back from Richmond, and headed to Philadelphia. And I kept an open mind when I was writing the book. I was looking for evidence, but so the theory actually was generated by a train conductor who claimed that he saw Poe on the train and uh, and 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 shepherded him back to Baltimore when he saw his condition. Um, the train's conductor's name was George Rawlings, but they spelled it wrong. But all the biographers spelled it wrong. I dug into the actually I found it in the Baltimore Sun. That's where I found it. I found the correct spelling, and then I found all this information about George Rawlings. It turns out he was indeed a train conductor, but not for the line that Poe would have used to go to Philadelphia. He was a train conductor for the B&O. The line that went from Baltimore to Philadelphia was the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad, the PW&B, and he never worked for them. And as it turned out, in 1849, he wasn't even working for any railroad in 1849. He was actually handling a freight business here in Baltimore. So, I mean, if he got on a train, there's absolutely no evidence to support that if you take away this tale. Moran bought into it too, and he claims to have claimed the fella came forward right after Poe's death. When I don't believe that at all. But anyway, this story that came from the train conductor is completely false.
Two quick things about that. First of all, research for this book wasn't just primary sources here at Pratt. You're talking about did you use the historic Baltimore Sun database, or did you
use the
microfilm or
the Baltimore Sun, the Evening Sun? I spent some time in the Baltimore archives. I was looking for some kind of certificate on his death, a coroner's report, a coroner's inquest. They have all the coroner's inquest up there, and I was desperately trying to find that. But no, I was the internet, is an embarrassment now compared to what authors and biographers had to do 25 years ago, even.
Yeah, and you just hinted at this a little bit, but there's something you said about the spelling of his name, and anyone that does research with primary sources, if you could talk about that, I would really appreciate that, because anyone that's interested in genealogical research or historic research knows that names are spelled
the spelling. I mean,
spelled bad and why they are.
I mean, first you have to go back and see who gave the name, not just in Poe's time, but the 19th century, and how they're pronouncing it. Because I found even the owners of Gunner's Hall was spelled incorrectly, and I found the true owners, by figuring out how they were pronouncing the name. But anyway, you have to, when you research, you have to try all these misspellings. You have to try these all these versions of the name, and just cross your fingers. And that's how I found a lot of this stuff.
And if a human's not transcribing what they see in a record, if there's some kind of optical recognition.
I'm not really sure about William Cullen's spelling, and Cullen is a pretty common name. And if it's spelled wrong, I mean, that's the reason why I haven't been able to find much on him so far.
I have a couple more questions before I want to open things up to the audience, and I would love for you to read a little bit more. Could I get you to talk about happy accidents that happen when you're researching? Did anything drop off the shelf onto your head? Were you researching one thing and discovered something totally different? Just what role did those happy research accidents play in your book?
Well, I've already touched on a couple of them. The letter to Sarah Rice that alerted me that there was a viewing at the hospital. After I read that, I started looking again, and I found actually two articles written by the reverend that actually conducted the service, and he gives details of what took place in the hospital. And up until this time, this book, everybody was thinking that the funeral service was held at Henry Herring's house on Pratt Street. There's a lot of that. I found checking bibliographical references, and Mabbitt, Thomas Mabbitt, which one of the greatest Poe scholars ever, claimed that Poe lived in East Baltimore on Caroline Street. Well, I went back to find the article that he used for his opinion, and he misread the article. And I found out that Poe probably didn't live in East Baltimore and Caroline Street. So there's a lot of that.
If there is one document, one manuscript, one primary source out there that you wish existed, that's just at the tip of your fingers, that you want to turn up in an attic or turn up in the city archives or fall out of somebody's trunk, what would that be?
Well, the obvious thing is a death certificate. I mean, a death certificate would list the cause of death.
And
But-
why? And why isn't there one?
Well, that's a good question. The state and the county, and the state did not require it at the time. It wasn't required. The county was the authority then, and Baltimore City was actually the county seat at the time. But neither the state or the county required a death certificate, and pretty much until the Civil War. When the bodies came back from the front from the battles, that was a different matter, and that's when there was a great push for death certificates. But in 1849, the authorities didn't require it. So there was probably none written. But beyond a death certificate, a hospital case record, that would be just as good, because that would give a blow-by-blow description of what was happening to him and what happened to him at the end and what they believed the cause of death was. Those records did exist. And in Baltimore City, they were submitted to the Board of Health, and they tabulated them for interment reports that were presented to the City Council. And the City Council would make the report, and then the reports were discarded. If I could find that would put an end to everything.
Before I open this up to everyone and you ask all the good questions that I forgot to ask totally, I have to ask a question that's going to make you groan. I think Annabelle, it sounds like Annabelle Lee probably is, might be your favorite work of Poe's. Do you have a favorite Poe story? I ask this to every single person that comes in the library. What's your favorite Poe story? What's your favorite Poe story, David?
Well, I'm not. For me, Poe is about poetry. I've always preferred his poetry to his short stories. But having said that, I like one of his earlier stories that he wrote here in Baltimore called The Visionary. It was later retitled as The Assignation. And it's a love story. It's a tale of Romeo and Juliet, modeled on Lord Byron's life. And it's my favorite Poe short story. It's not gory. It's not gothic. It's not, well, it's sort of gothic, but I mean, it's not horrible.
David, I really enjoyed asking you these questions. Do we have any questions from the audience? If you want to come up to the microphone, or if you want me to walk over to you, could you answer a couple questions from
Sure.
people that are here today? Oh, Hannah, please. Yeah.
David.
Hi.
I'm really interested in the syphilis debate about his death, and how the symptoms are so consistent with someone who would be suffering from that disease at that time. The syphilis theory of his death. And from your research, what for you would indicate that would not be the cause of death? Because when we think about the time in which Poe lived, and that those symptoms can progress over the course of like 10 or 12 years, I'm really interested in what research you found that would indicate that it was not that, including rabies, which is also similar. Yeah.
Sort of encephalitis, versions of encephalitis. First, you should know that some scholars think that Poe was celibate, that he had different wiring than most men at the time, and may have never had a sexual relationship, right? But that's theory. It's my understanding, I'm not a doctor, but it's my understanding that syphilis, the symptoms of syphilis are progressive, and what kills you at the end is flagged well in advance. And to my mind, I mean, there's no association of those symptoms with Poe. His health record doesn't indicate that at all, and the terminal symptoms are really not consistent with that.
Yeah, great. And one for Eben, if I may.
Oh, yeah.
The letter that was written by Virginia to Poe, the cryptography, like
The
putting his
poem,
name
yes.
in the poem, was that written before or after the one he wrote to Frances Osgood? And was it also printed? Did she send it to a magazine to be printed as well?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to the second. Do you?
Yeah.
Was it sent to a magazine to be printed? It was published.
Do you
Okay.
know
It was
where?
published. I don't know what I think. It may not have been published contemporaneously. It might have been published later years. Frances Osgood's poem was published at the time she wrote it, and that was before Virginia wrote hers.
Yeah. And because Virginia's was published, did Virginia send that off to be published?
No,
No.
no,
Who
that
was
was
it?
that was a private thing that she wrote to Poe.
And she wrote that and gave it to her husband
Yes,
after the one he wrote to Frances Osgood.
yes, it was.
Yeah.
It was following that
Like a
publication of that
response.
poem, right?
Yeah, great.
Mhm.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Thank you
Thank
very
you, Anne.
much.
Does anybody else have any questions?
We're all friends here.
Testing.
I can
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, well, I just read a little bit, I don't know where, but before coming here, and that he was on his way to New York because he was expecting to get married and he was going to pick up his aunt or something. So, I mean, if you're going to get married, doesn't that indicate something like some level of health or something that would.
He was on his way ultimately to New York. He had to his attention from for what we know, he was to stop in Philadelphia and edit a collection of poems for a woman, and then from there go to New York, collect his aunt from the cottage in Fordham, and then return to Richmond to marry Elmira Shelton. In one of the letters that's here at the here at the Pratt Library, Poe demonstrates that he was not very enthusiastic about the marriage. That he was doing it for reasons other than romance. Let's just say that. But beyond that, I mean, you read the letters, and he was not really expecting the end of his life to come. No, he was making plans to, for more things.
Does anybody else have any questions?
About it comes later though. It's not so much about the death, but when he was moved from the back of the cemetery to the front, and it was much more of a big to do about it. I was sort of impressed that Whitman organized a lot. And
Walt Whitman?
yeah,
Whitman was in attendance, but he was not invited. Sarah Rice did not invite him, and there's every indication that she intentionally did not invite him. He pretty much crashed the party.
really.
Now he was, to be fair to Walt Whitman, he was suffering at the time. He was in D.C. And he was on his way back home to I think he was living in Camden at that time. And he was on his way back home and decided to attend the ceremony here in Baltimore. He was suffering from a stroke, and he couldn't speak. He couldn't have delivered an address anyway if he wanted to. He was on the platform, on the speaker's platform, as a celebrity. He was recognized, and they put him up there, but he was not invited at all. He had nothing to do with the organization of the event.
I was going to add, it's interesting in the Sarah Rice papers, which we call it the Edgar Allan Poe collection, and it comes from various sources. It's an artificial collection in that sense. But in the Sarah Rice papers, which cover, they're kind of the administrative records that involved moving his body and getting the grave built. She does, I don't think Whitman's mentioned, but she does write to Longfellow and Lord Alfred Tennyson, among others, to get an epitaph, and she gets very cool responses back, very poor suggestions, even kind of blown off a little bit. And we have those manuscripts in the collection. I find that fascinating.
William Cullen Bryant.
William Cullen Bryant
is the one that comes to mind. I mean, he told Sarah Rice why he was not going to write anything.
Was that the one that's kind of dismissive to her in general,
right.
to the school teacher in Baltimore?
Right. He apparently he bought into all the Griswold biography, so he wasn't gonna help her out at all. But Tennyson actually wrote something, and why it's not on the monument, I don't know. It's a short little. It's like 4 lines or something like that. It's pretty clever, but most of them, like you're saying, they wrote with their regrets, but Tennyson actually wrote something for the monument.
Do we have any other questions? Thank you.
Just for Evan, particularly the collections part was very fascinating. I just want to thank you, as seen a bit, for that, because it taught me a lot more about him. Despite what you hear and read or whatnot, it's very fascinating what you guys have here.
Yeah, I'm really lucky to have the collection and work with it every day. And it's amazing. I have all these primary sources right there, but we talk about the myths that seep into Poe's biography, and my brain is full of the myths. I can't separate fact from fiction. So it's great to talk to David, who's so even-handed about all of this.
And I did all, I may add, before I visited the grave with my ex at the time, because I wanted to learn more before I went to the grave site and everything with him. So thank you.
No, I'm glad you were in there using the collection. We enjoyed having you.
Yes.
Did Griswold write the obituary that appeared like the day after? Or?
Yes. Was it in the Herald, or I think it was in the New York Herald? He wrote it under pseudonym. He anticipated some criticism, so he wrote it under the name Ludwig. But he wrote the initial obituary, and it went across the country.
Well, it really tore him from.
Well, not like the biography.
The first sentence was like, people will be surprised by his death, but not many would be aggrieved. Like, well, you're off to a good start with the obituary there.
But that was in a newspaper, and like I say, it was a short obituary, and it didn't drop the bomb like the biography did. That really hurt Poe.
Yeah, I work on a figure from about 1700, and a similar thing happens. The actual figure, and then there's all this. Actually, in the around 1700, there's more like legendary things happen, and all kinds of stories and go. But it's very difficult to correct the record. Every single fact has been distorted. Like, and I found like. I want to get to actually his actual writings, and we don't even know. So much has been attributed to him that he didn't write, and trying to get there's no critical edition, and there's no scholarly biography of this particular guy, and it's like, and then now you're correcting the record with this book, but it's like, how can these things live on? It's kind of like the bibliographers have said things, and other people have said things. It's so difficult to get it to move the course of the ship somehow.
I know what you're saying. All I can do is hope in time that this will make an impact. But as far as immediate impact, probably not. People know what they know, and this isn't going to change their minds. I'm thinking about some of the biographies that came out that did eventually change people's minds about Poe. It took a long time, but the first couple of biographies the first vindicatory biographies that were written by Poe were badly written. The scholarship was not very good. But they, again, like Griswold's memoir, people relied on them, and some of the facts were wrong, and they stayed around for a long time. When I'm thinking Quinn's biography came out in 1941. It didn't really immediately put everything to rest. But today everybody points to his biography. I mean, that's the one. That's the one story of Poe that everybody relies on now, including myself.
But I hate to say it, but it also seems like Poe, the distortions in mythology, he wears it pretty well, you know.
That's the thing, though. The mythology is a lot more fun than the historical, and so it lives on as a story of its own. And you sort of don't want to mess with that because it's fun for people, and it's almost as good as better than the actual history sometimes. Yeah.
Well, on that note, I found your book fun though.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, no, I get.
No, I'm joking.
Makes two of us.
Yeah.
But we're in a small club.
Anything else? Oh. All right, well, we want to thank David for coming and talking to us. And I'm sure if you want to stick around for a little bit, I'd love to talk to you without a microphone in his hand also. If you want to visit the library, if you're interested in viewing the collection, you can reach out to me. Email SPC, that stands for Special Collections, @prattlibrary.org, edennis@prattlibrary.org. Call us. We're easy to find. My colleague Natalie is sitting back there. Talk to either of us, and we can get you an appointment to look at the collection whenever you'd like. Thank you so much.